Something is wrong in a city where babies can be legally unnamed. I learned that before I learned my own face. In the underground districts of Seoul-Averne, sunlight is measured, auctioned, and taxed before it reaches skin. The upper shafts collect it through mirrored wells, convert it to charge stones, and send it down by quota. The rich buy daylight by the hour. The poor rent glow from communal lamps. If a household misses payment, the city does not shut off power first. It marks the family record, lowers food priority, and freezes movement through the transit gates until the debt is cleared. In Seoul-Averne, the first law is simple. If the registry cannot see you, the city can do anything to you. I was left at the registry annex before dawn during a flood cycle, wrapped in a maintenance tarp with no family seal, no bloodline sigil, and no speaking name. There are official words for that. Unclaimed minor, unverified lineage, provisional state burden. The older clerks had another word, drain-born. I know this because years later, I stole my own intake file from a locked shelf and read every line twice. The file said I arrived with one object, a bronze token stamped with a sunburst crest that had been filed down until only 3 rays remained. It also said the token was transferred to evidence storage and then lost during shelf relocation. In Seoul-Averne, things only get lost when someone paid to stop them from being found. By then, I was old enough to know that a missing record is not an accident. It is a decision with a signature removed. I was raised in Tier 9, where the air smelled like metal dust and wet limestone, and the daylight lamps flickered if the freight lifts ran heavy above noon. The state orphan quarters called it shelter. Everyone else called it sorting. Children were assessed, numbered, and assigned by utility potential. Strong ones went to lift crews. Quick-handed ones went to relay maintenance or salvage tunnels. The rest were fed enough to survive and blamed for costing too much light. I was quick, small, and good at listening without looking like I listened. That kept me alive. It also put me in the wrong room when I was 14. The room was under the quarter chapel, behind a water cistern and a wall of cracked icons no one cleaned anymore. I was there to steal copper contacts from a decommissioned lamp ballast. That was the plan. Then I heard voices through the stone and stopped moving. "There's no issue," one man said. His accent was upper-tier polished and careful, the kind that never rushed because everyone else was expected to wait. The child's intake line was closed. A woman answered, lower voice irritated. "Closed is not erased. The annex log still shows a timestamp. Shit, without a name, with a token." A pause, paper shifting. Then the woman again. "If the guild auditors connect the token to the Helian succession..." The man cut her off. "They won't. The family corrected the matter years ago." Corrected. Not resolved, not denied. Corrected. I should have stayed hidden and memorized every word. Instead, I shifted my foot on the wet stone, and the ballast frame I was crouched behind rolled and clanged like a bell. Silence on the other side. I ran. That was the night the city started looking at me differently. By morning, the orphan quarter supervisor had my bunk searched. By afternoon, my meal tag stopped scanning on the first try. By evening, 2 men from district records arrived with smiles too soft for their boots. They asked whether I had been wandering under chapel maintenance and whether I had encountered restricted conversation. I said no, then no again, then nothing. They left me with a warning and a new classification mark on my slate, observation risk. 3 days later, someone tried to push me into a vent shaft while the relay fans were active. It wasn't a dramatic ambush, no speeches, no obvious enemy, just a hand at my back on a ladder, a muttered, "Watch it," and a hard shove at the exact moment the fan blades spooled. I caught the side rail with 2 fingers and half a shoulder, lost 3 nails, nearly lost the arm. I saw who did it when I hauled myself back up. Taryn. He was 16 then, quarter runner, loudmouth, always laughing first in a fight, because he thought fear looked like weakness. Everyone said he was cruel because he enjoyed it. That wasn't true. Taryn was cruel because he had learned early that if he made the room laugh, no one looked at his bruises. He looked down at me hanging over the shaft and went pale. I slipped, he said. I said nothing. Ray, help me up. He did. That should have been the end of us. It was not. In Soul Avern, the person who almost kills you and then chooses not to finish it may become the closest thing you have to family. Taryn spent the next week shadowing me badly, picking fights with anyone who came near my bunk, stealing meal credits and pretending he hadn't. On the 7th night, he sat beside me behind the boiler pipes and said, "They paid me to scare you. I panicked." Who? He stared at the steam leak in front of us. A man from records. Silver ring, burn scar under his jaw. Said if you kept asking about your intake file, they'd move you to the lower mines. I never asked in public. Doesn't matter, you looked. That was true. In Soul Avern, looking at the wrong shelf can cost more than stealing from it. Taryn became useful after that. He knew which quarter matrons sold access to old storage keys, which relay techs could be bribed with ration chocolate, which clerks drank enough to talk. He was all noise and bad posture and sharp instincts. People underestimated him because he grinned when he lied. That habit saved us both more than once. At 15, I got selected for guild intake trials. Selection sounds honorable until you've seen how they do it. The Guild of Lumen Exchange controlled chargestone circulation, transit permissions, and most legal trade moving between tiers. They needed couriers, auditors, enforcers, appraisers, and occasionally deniable hands. Every year, they ran aptitude trials in the lower districts under the pretense of social mobility. What they were really buying was trained obedience with a useful background. Still, it was better than the mines. The trial hall sat beneath Tier 7 market arches, lit by suspended prism lamps bright enough to hurt. We stood in lines by number while clerks checked pulse, balance, reflex, and ledger literacy. Then came the sunlight test. That test is how Soul Avern measures both wealth and power. Each applicant places a hand on a calibrated charge stone and draws light through a breathing pattern taught in public schools. Most people can stabilize a faint current. Some can shape it into heat or edge or seal marks if trained. A few lineages can do more, but those families do not send children to lower-tier public trials. I had no training, no lineage on record, no reason to pass. When my turn came, the examiner barely looked at me. State number, 972. Hand on stone, draw to mark. I touched the stone. The current hit my palm and went wrong, not wild, not explosive. Wrong in a way the room recognized before I did. The charge stone brightened, then dimmed, then brightened again in a steady double beat that matched my pulse and then overrode it. A light crawled up my wrist in thin geometric lines and formed a sigil I had never seen, complex and old-looking, like the city registry marks but built in circles instead of blocks. The examiner jerked backward hard enough to knock over his stool. "Break contact!" he shouted. I tried. My hand would not release. The sigil on my skin tightened with each beat. The stone started humming. Across the hall, 3 other charge stones flickered in sympathy. The safety shutters over the prism lamp slammed halfway down by automatic response, and the trial hall alarms began to ring. A safe system had failed in front of everyone. 2 guild guards pinned my shoulders and hit the emergency discharge rod against the stone. The current snapped. I dropped to my knees with blood running from my nose and both ears, vision blown white for a few seconds. By the time I could focus, the examiner was no longer afraid. He was interested. "Mark him restricted," he said quietly to the clerk. "No public ranking. A transfer to provisional evaluation." That phrase meant I had just stopped being a student candidate and started being a classified asset. Taryn found me that night in the transit cage, where they were holding trial anomalies until paperwork cleared. He had somehow bribed his way past 2 gate checks and a board guard with a broken thumbnail and a counterfeit quarter seal. "You look terrible," he said through the bars. "I feel expensive." He crouched, grin gone. "They changed your tag. You're not on the posted list." I noticed. He slid a wrapped packet through the lower gap, salt bread and dried mushroom strips, still warm. "I heard a clerk say they're sending you to Hall C under guild custody. People go in there and come out with better coats and dead eyes. I've always wanted a better coat. Taryn looked at me for a long time, then leaned closer. I got something else. From inside his sleeve, he pulled a folded copy slip. Guild formatting, access log excerpt. He pushed it through the bars with the food. How did you get this? Don't insult me by asking. The slip showed a restricted retrieval request from Registry Annex Archival Storage. Date: 2 days after my trial. Requesting office: Lumen Exchange Internal Audit. Item code partially redacted, but the final description line was enough. Bronze token, damaged, sunburst crest, evidence transfer. My token, the one that was supposedly lost years earlier. I looked up. Taryn's voice dropped. They're moving because of what happened in the hall. I said, if they have the token, they have a link. Then stop sitting there bleeding and make a plan. That was Taryn. No speeches, no comfort, just the next problem. Guild custody lasted 6 years. This is where people expect a montage, hard training, rise through the ranks, clean revenge arc. That is not how it happened. Guildhall C was an audit compound disguised as a courier school. We learned ledger law, root encryption, contract seals, relic handling, and field restraint techniques. We also learned what happens when you fail. Meals got lighter, sleep got shorter, mistakes were written down in your permanent utility score. You could leave, technically, if you repaid training costs and surrendered all certifications. No one from Tier 9 ever could. They called my condition a pulse-binding anomaly. They said the double beat draw was unstable and likely lethal if forced. They also kept testing it. The rules they gave me were strict and consistent. I could channel only through approved stones. Never draw while injured. Never sync with another active user. Never sustain beyond 12 breaths. If I broke those rules, the rebound would damage memory retention first, then motor control, then the heart. I believed them because I watched another trainee ignore a discharge limit and forget his own brother's face for a week. Power in Sol Avern always has a receipt. By 21, I had become useful enough to travel upper tiers and deniable enough to send where official auditors would cause trouble. I read ledgers in hidden warehouses. I traced missing charge stones through shell merchants. I retrieved cursed objects no normal courier was paid enough to touch. My pulse binding made relic scans easier because certain old devices woke to the rhythm and revealed hidden compartments or suppressed marks. The guild loved results and distrusted me for producing them. That balance kept me alive. I got rich slowly first, then quickly. Not rich in the public way. No mansions, no parades, no name on tower glass. Rich in ownership chains, debt notes, salvage claims, and discrete positions in transit cooperatives that everyone ignored until a blackout. I learned from the people who thought I was only listening to route instructions. I learned which districts would get new light wells before the announcements. Which families over-leveraged on glow futures. Which guild directors were secretly shorting their own convoy insurance. I bought through proxies and dissolved the proxies before they could be traced back. By 28, I had enough capital parked in foreign vault syndicates to vanish if I wanted. I did not vanish. I kept one apartment in Tier 5, one office with no personal decor, and one locked drawer containing the copy slip Taryn pushed through the transit bars all those years ago. The ink had faded at the folds. I could still read the item description. Bronze token, damaged, sunburst crest. Taryn, meanwhile, became exactly what nobody predicted. He failed 3 formal guild exams, got banned from 2 transit halls for gambling, and somehow built the most reliable informal logistics network in the lower tiers by doing favors no reputable broker would touch. He could move medicine past quota checks, secure paper records when digital routes were scrubbed, and produce a key to almost any old municipal lock if you gave him a day and enough tea. He also called me insufferable every time we met. "You talk like a contract now," he said over dinner one winter, tearing bread with his hands. "That's how I know you're doing well. You steal battery cores from your own clients. I borrow from men who overcharge hospitals. Language matters." It did. In Sol Avern, Language was often the only difference between law and theft. I started the return because of a threat bulletin, not a dramatic prophecy, not a hidden letter. A standard guild circulation warning flagged for internal audit review. The bulletin reported unusual buying pressure on lower-tier redevelopment bonds, concentrated around Tier 9 and the old Annex District. Attached were foreclosure projections, transit reroute proposals, and one recommendation from the Civic Renewal Office. Accelerate clearance of legacy state housing before flood season. Clearance. Another clean word. The projections included the orphan quarter where I grew up. I read the bulletin twice, then opened 4 shell accounts, called in 3 markers, and began buying every distress note tied to the annex perimeter before the market understood what the city was about to do. Publicly, it looked like opportunistic speculation. Privately, it gave me a legal foothold in the district where I was left unnamed. That was the business reason. The personal reason arrived 2 days later in my office at dusk, wearing a porter coat and a bad fake limp. Taryn shut the door, pulled off the coat, and threw a sealed envelope onto my desk. "Your favorite people are moving early." The envelope bore the crest of the Hellion Domestic Trust, one of the oldest upper-tier houses in Seoul Avern, and a name spoken carefully in guild rooms. Their public wealth came from mirror wells and civic endowments. Their private power came from succession law, bloodline contracts, and the habit of surviving every political shift by funding both outcomes. I looked at him. "How did you get this?" "Messenger dropped dead in a car den. Natural causes, terrible timing, very sad." "Open it." The seal was not meant for me. It required helium line resonance to dissolve cleanly. I should have used a bypass solvent and copied the contents. Instead, I touched it barehanded, mostly to test an old suspicion I had never said aloud. The wax warmed. The sigil opened. Taryn stopped breathing for a second. "Ray." Inside was a succession directive draft addressed to Hellion Legal Counsel. Half complete, unsigned, marked for revision. It referenced a historical intake irregularity and recommended contingency responses if the unregistered issue became discoverable through guild audit channels. Several options were listed: buy silence, contest identity, transfer liability to a dead branch. A final line item: if verification cannot be prevented, negotiate private settlement before public claim. No names, no direct confession, enough. Taryn sat down without asking. "Tell me I'm reading this wrong." "You're not." He rubbed both hands over his face. "You think they abandoned you because of succession." "I think someone with Helion authority paid to erase an intake record and lose a token. This draft says they still consider the problem alive." He stared at the broken seal on my desk. "And the seal opened for you." Neither of us spoke for a while. Outside the office windows, Tier 5 evening lamps came online in sequence, a soft amber wave climbing the transit pillars. People below kept walking. Vendors kept shouting. A train rolled through on time. The city always looks stable from the right height. Taryn broke the silence first. "What do you want? Money, recognition, their name?" I almost answered quickly. That would have been a lie. "I want the original file," I said. "The intake timestamp. A token chain of custody. Whoever signed the correction. I want the record before they decide what version of me they can afford." Taryn gave me a long look. "That is a worse plan than revenge." "I know." He leaned back and let out a short, humorless laugh. "Good. I was worried success had softened you." We started that night. There are formal channels for identity claims in Seoul Avern. They exist to fail slowly. You submit evidence, pay review fees, wait for a magistrate panel, and watch sealed archives become mysteriously inaccessible by the time your hearing date arrives. I did not use them. Instead, I used ownership. Within a week, my proxies controlled enough redevelopment debt around the old annex to trigger a mandatory infrastructure inspection before civic clearance. Inspections require archive verification for occupancy lineage and historical state liability. Archive verification requires registry access. Registry access creates logs. Logs create pressure. Pressure makes people move too fast. It worked. 3 officials from Civic Renewal, 1 Helian legal observer, and 2 guild compliance auditors were scheduled to inspect annex sublevel records on the same morning. I added myself to the guild audit team under internal authority and watched the objections arrive in triplicate. I rejected all of them. The morning of the inspection, I stood in front of the annex for the first time in 13 years. The building was smaller than I remembered, and meaner. Concrete skin stained green from runoff. Window grates patched and repatched. The old intake bell still hanging by the side door, rusted but intact. Someone had painted over the state seal and failed to cover it completely. The ghost of it showed through when the lamp angle shifted. A line of residents had already formed by the transit curb, holding relocation notices and utility appeals. Most had no idea what the inspection actually meant. They only knew men in clean coats had started measuring their walls. Taryn waited near the drainage channel pretending to argue with a tea seller. He did not look at me directly when I passed. Good habit. Inside, the annex smelled exactly the same. Mold, paper dust, disinfectant, old fear. The archive clerk assigned to our inspection was a narrow man with a polished scalp and hands that trembled only when he thought no one was watching. Silver ring, burn scar under the jaw. Older, heavier, but the same man Taryn described from the orphan quarter. He read my audit credential, then my face, then the credential again. I watched him realize who I was not supposed to become. Inspector Rael Voss, he said carefully. Guild internal audit. Unexpected. That was the name I used in guild work. Rael Voss. Bought, built, and legally clean. Inspection notices were filed, I said. Sublevel storage is unstable. Some shelves remain under contamination seal. Then we'll document the instability. His gaze shifted to the Helian legal observer standing behind me, a woman in charcoal with a neutral expression and gloves too fine for this building. She gave the smallest possible nod. The clerk smiled. Of course. We went down. Sublevel records sat beneath floodlines and old heating ducts, rows of compact shelves on manual tracks, because the digitization grants had never reached Tier 9 except on paper. The inspection team spread out in the usual formation. Civic officials measuring liability exposure, compliance auditors checking chain codes, Helian observer pretending this was unrelated to them. I walked straight to intake archive year register, flood cycle range matching my estimated birth season. The clerk moved to block me. Those shelves are restricted pending mold review. I held up the inspection writ. State liability verification supersedes mold review. He lowered his voice. Inspector, there are procedural ways to handle historical irregularities. There it was. Not denial. Negotiation. I looked at his ring. You were here the year they corrected my file. His face went flat. I don't know what you mean. Then you won't mind opening the shelf. For a second, I thought he might call security early and force the whole thing into a legal fight upstairs. Instead, he stepped aside, entered a key code, and released the track lock. His hand shook once. He hid it by adjusting his cuff. The shelves rolled open with a grinding sound like old teeth. The file was not where it should have been. There was a gap in the sequence, a clean removal. Adjacent folders intact, labels aligned, dust marks broken only on one slot. Safe systems fail quietly too. I heard Taryn before I saw him. Not his voice. His knock pattern on a pipe through the wall beyond record storage. Too fast, one slow, too fast. Trouble. At the same moment, the Helian observer said from behind us, Inspector Voss, step away from the shelf. I turned. She held a compact civic warrant slate already activated. The screen displayed a fresh order stamped by District Security Tribunal, seizure of investigative authority, suspension of guild audit privileges, detention of Rael Voss pending inquiry into falsified credentials, market manipulation, and unlawful interference with succession-protected assets. They had moved faster than I expected. The civic officials backed away immediately. The compliance auditors looked furious, mostly because being outplayed in front of witnesses offends guild people more than corruption does. The clerk did not look surprised. He looked relieved. I read the warrant and then looked at the timestamp. Issued 11 minutes before our inspection started, prepared in advance, framed before entry. Yet the Helian observer met my eyes and spoke in the same neutral tone she had used upstairs. If you come quietly, private settlement remains possible. There are moments when anger narrows your thinking. There are other moments when it clears it. Mine cleared. If they had the warrant ready, they knew I would come. If they knew I would come, they expected me to go for the intake shelf first, which meant the missing file was not the point. The point was to arrest me in the archive, attach fraud to my name, and discredit any future claim before evidence surfaced. I raised both hands slowly. Of course, I said. I would hate to interfere with a pre-written outcome. The observer's eyes sharpened just a little. What did you say? Before I answered, the sub-level lamps flickered. Once, twice. Then the emergency backup glyphs lit red across the ceiling, and a mechanical voice announced a district-wide transit interruption caused by unexpected load balancing. Load balancing during clear weather, outside quota shift, wrong timing, wrong code. A broadcast alert that contradicted what everyone in the room was seeing. Taryn's knock sounded again, harder now, behind the pipe wall. The clerk went pale. I looked at the observer, at the predated warrant, at the empty file slot, and understood two things at once. They had planned my arrest, and someone else had chosen the same hour to break the annex open for a different reason. In Saul Averne, when powerful people schedule a clean operation and the lights fail under them, you do not assume coincidence. You choose which trap to survive first. I moved before the warrant officers reached the stairs. The Hellion observer reacted fast. I'll give her that. She snapped, "Hold him!" And one of the civic men lunged for my arm as if he'd trained for arrests and forgotten he worked redevelopment paperwork. I turned under his grip, drove his wrist into the edge of the shelf track, and sent the warrant slate skidding across the wet concrete. The sub-level lights dropped from white to emergency red. In that color, everyone looked guilty. The clerk backed into the records desk hard enough to rattle the drawers. "Seal the sub-level," he shouted, but his voice broke on the second word. The compliance auditors were already moving toward the stairs, more interested in preserving their own authority than stopping me. That told me everything. Whatever was happening above us was bigger than my identity claim, and they knew it. Taryn's knock came again through the pipe wall. Too fast, one slow, too fast. Now. I grabbed the nearest shelf handle and yanked the intake row sideways. The old track shrieked, files spilled. Dust and mold lifted into the air. The Helian observer swore and reached for something inside her coat. Probably a comms pin, maybe a shock tag. I kicked the base of the shelf into her path and ran toward the rear wall where the heating pipes disappeared into masonry. There was no door there. There never had been one. But in buildings like the annex, walls lie differently than people do. You learn the difference by sound. I struck the pipe bracket with the heel of my hand, found the hollow note behind the third clamp, and drove my shoulder into the panel seam just as the backup lights flickered again. Plaster cracked. A section of wall gave inward with a burst of dust and damp air. Yet Taryn was on the other side in a service crawl space, one hand on a pry bar, the other holding a lamp rig made from a bike battery and a transit lens. "You took too long," he said. "You brought me into an active warrant trap." "Yeah, and I also brought the exit. Move." I climbed through as boots hit the sub-level stairs behind us. Someone yelled my guild name. Someone else yelled, "Do not damage the records," which would have been funny if they weren't trying to bury mine. Taryn shoved the broken panel back into place, and we ran bent double through the crawl space while dust fell from the pipes overhead. The annex sounded wrong above us. Too many feet, too many voices, and underneath all of it, a low mechanical hum that didn't belong to any lighting failure I knew. "Load balancing alert?" I said. "That was yours?" Taryn gave me a look over his shoulder. "You think I can fake district transit announcements now? I'm flattered." "Then what did you do?" "I bribed a boiler tech, cut a service lock." and found out 4 men in gray uniforms were already in the wall before dawn, carrying crate tools with no city markings. Then your inspection started and the lights went weird, so I came down. Crate tools, no markings, gray uniforms, not official civic crews then. Private contractors or security, probably upper-tier funded. My arrest was one operation. Something inside the annex was another. Same window, same building. Did you see where they went? I asked. Old intake chamber side, behind the chapel cistern. I almost stopped running. The chapel wall, the room where I overheard the Helian conversation at 14, the place where this started moving around me. Taryn saw my face and swore. No, don't do that look. What look? The one where your brain starts choosing the dangerous answer because it sounds cleaner. The crawlspace split ahead into a narrow maintenance ladder up toward the chapel undercroft, and a runoff duct leading toward the rear drainage tunnels. The smart move was the duct. Get clear, regroup. Use legal and illegal channels at the same time. Force Helian to respond to the predated warrant. Trace who triggered the outage. Instead, I grabbed the ladder rung. Taryn caught my sleeve. Ray. If they're opening old intake chambers during a pre-planned arrest, they're not here for redevelopment. They're here for something hidden. That does not mean we climb into it. It does if it's mine. He held on for half a second longer, jaw tight, then let go in disgust. I hate that you can say things like that and be right. We went up. The ladder hatch opened into the undercroft behind the orphan quarter chapel, a room I had not seen since the night I heard Helian succession through stone and ran. It looked smaller now and more deliberate, stripped of clutter. Half the old icon wall removed. Someone had been working here recently. Fresh scrape marks on the floor. New power cables fed through a hole in the rear masonry. A portable relay lamp cast white light over equipment cases, and one exposed section of original intake foundation stone. And standing beside the stone, directing 2 gray uniformed contractors with a tablet slate in hand, was Sister Malin. If you've never lived in a state orphan quarter, Sister can mislead you. Some are caregivers, some are clerks with soft shoes. Malin was both and neither. She ran Tier 9 quarters for 12 years with a smile that never changed, and a memory for every child's debts, punishments, and utility scores. She used to touch my shoulder before assigning extra labor, as if kindness and control were the same thing. I had not seen her in over a decade. She looked older, thinner, but perfectly composed in chapel gray with a waterproof overcoat. Her eyes landed on me, then Taryn, and she exhaled once as if a delayed appointment had finally arrived. Rael, she said using my guild name, not the quarter one. I asked them to move faster. Taryn actually laughed from pure disbelief. You framed him and then got impatient? Malin ignored him. The warrant was inevitable once Helian Legal entered the inspection. I needed you off the public record floor and in a room where people would stop pretending procedure mattered. I took a step toward her. You knew the file would be missing. I removed it. That landed harder than the warrant. One contractor reached for a shock baton. Malin lifted 2 fingers without looking, and he froze. Authority then. Real authority, or borrowed convincingly. I said, You erased my intake line. No. Her gaze sharpened. I kept it from being destroyed. She tapped the exposed foundation stone. One of the contractors backed away and lifted a magnetic drill from a cut seam. The stone panel, centuries old by the look of it, was shifted outward on concealed hinges. Behind it was a narrow cavity lined with lead mesh and wax seals, old registry work. Inside sat a metal coffer, blackened at the corners, stamped with a crest I felt in my chest before I recognized it. Sunburst. Filed down to 3 rays. The same mark as the bronze token in my stolen copy slip. Taryn went quiet beside me. Malin said, Your file was a decoy point after the first correction. The actual intake packet and evidence chain were split and hidden under legacy church protections, because no one trusted the annex ledgers after the Helian payment. Her mouth tightened on the last word. I was younger then. I told myself I was preserving options. You told yourself a lot of things, I said. Yes. No denial, no plea. The city hum deepened through the floor. Not power failure this time. A transit line rerouting under emergency priority. Someone had escalated outside. Malin glanced toward the chapel ceiling, listening with the same instinct I remembered from fire drills and ration riots. We have minutes. Helian's observer came for your arrest. The men in gray came for this coffer. They are not on the same chain, which is why the outage happened. Two private operations collided in a public building. That tracked. The annex had become a choke point because too many people needed one thing from it at once, and none of them trusted the others enough to coordinate cleanly. Who are the gray contractors? I asked. Mirrorwell Asset Recovery, a Helian-adjacent firm on paper, independent when convenient. She looked at Taryn. One of their men is dead in the side stair. Was that your doing? Taryn grimaced. He slipped. Everyone slips around us, I said. One of the contractors near the coffer tried to edge backward toward the side door with a comms pin in hand. Taryn flicked his pry bar without warning. It cracked the man's knuckles and sent the pin spinning across the floor. Stay where your salary put you, Taryn said. I looked back at Malin. Open it. She hesitated. That was the first real break in her composure, and it told me more than any confession. Whatever was in the coffer was not just an intake certificate and a token. It was leverage with the kind of weight that kept people obedient for years. Open it, I said again. She reached into her sleeve and removed a ring key on a chain. Not civic issue, old registry brass. Her hand shook once while she fit it to the coffer latch. When the seal released, the sound was small, almost polite. Inside were 3 things wrapped in oilcloth and lead paper. An intake packet tied with red archive thread, a bronze token with the sunburst crest partly filed away, and a sealed envelope marked with a sigil I did not know, but felt immediately in my pulse, the same wrong recognition as the trial hall chargestone years ago. Malin saw my eyes on the envelope. Don't touch that first. Why? Because it was not in the coffer when I hid the rest. The room went still. Taryn said, say that again, slower. Malin kept her voice level. I sealed this cavity 12 years ago with the intake packet and the token only. When I reopened it this morning after the outage started, the envelope was inside. There are lies that arrive with too much detail. This wasn't one. If Malin wanted control, she would have pretended she knew exactly what the envelope was. Instead, she looked as unsettled as I felt. I ignored her warning and touched the seal. The sigil warmed under my fingers and opened like softened wax. Taryn swore softly. Not many seals do that for the wrong person. Maybe I'm not the wrong person, I said, but I barely heard myself. Inside the envelope was a single sheet written in registry shorthand on old stock, dated the year I was abandoned. And the header line read, Provisional Succession Containment Helian Domestic Trust/Private. Below that, a list of directives and clipped legal phrasing. Transfer the infant to state intake without naming. Remove identifying crest from evidence token. Pay annex correction to suppress intake association. Maintain child under observation only if pulse binding manifests. If manifestation confirmed, elevate recovery priority. Final line, signed with 2 initials and a stamped witness code. Do not register him dead. Use later if needed. Taryn made a sound I had never heard from him before. Not anger exactly. Something colder. Malin closed her eyes for a second. I never saw that document. No, I said. You just helped hide the consequences. That is true. The transit hum underfoot shifted into a hard vibration. Then the chapel bell above us rang once without being pulled. The contractors flinched. One started praying under his breath. A drone alert voice crackled over an external speaker somewhere in the annex corridor. District security response en route. Hold position. Archive seizure authority active. Warrant officers below, security above, private contractors in the walls. We were standing in a room with proof of Helian succession fraud and a document ordering me left alive for future recovery. If this became a sealed evidence fight, the city would bury it for another generation. I looked at the intake packet. Red thread, state wax, flood-stained edge. My original file. The one thing I came for and already not enough. Taryn read my face. You're thinking too far ahead. Start with surviving the building. Malin shook her head. He needs more than survival. If he leaves with only papers, Helion contests authenticity, civic stalls, the guild disavows his inspection, and security frames the outage as sabotage. You know how this works. I know how dying in basements works too, Taryn snapped. Malin turned to me. There is a way to force a contradiction. Also, I almost laughed at the phrase because the city keeps giving you the same pattern with different costumes. Say it, I said. The annex still has a legacy intake display board in the public hall, disconnected but wired to the old registry relay. If the original intake packet and token chain are authenticated through that board, while Helion's detention warrant is active, every witness in the building sees the conflict at once. State intake record versus succession-protected suppression order versus predated detention. Civic cannot quietly reclassify all of them before word spreads. Public truth in one undeniable event. Again. Taryn stared at her. You want us to parade through warrant officers and private retrieval crews to reach a dead display board? I want him to decide whether he wants a file in his hand or a record the city cannot fully take back. The answer hurt because it was obvious. I wrapped the intake packet and the bronze token. Slipped the Helion directive inside my coat and looked at Taryn. You still have the utility override tags? He patted his inner pocket. Always. Why do I always have to be right next to you when your life becomes a riot? Because you'd be offended to hear about it later. He pointed at Malin with the pry bar. And her? Malin removed her chapel passband and set it on the work table. I am already finished if Helion learns I kept the coffer. I'll guide you to the intake hall service stairs. After that, you choose whether I walk in front or stay behind. Front, Taryn said immediately. Agreed, I said. We moved through a side passage that cut behind the chapel nave and into a corridor of old records offices, stripped during budget closures. The city likes to call this modernization. In practice, it means the digital system gets funded and the paper backups rot until someone powerful needs deniability. As we passed the old nursery intake door, I slowed. The paint was newer than the frame. The handle had been replaced. But the threshold crack in the stone was the same one I used to trace with my shoe when I was little and waiting for assignment calls. Memory is strange like that. It gives you useless details in perfect focus and blurs the faces you wanted to keep. Malin noticed and said quietly, You were left here just before first bell. It was raining hard. I was on intake duty. I looked at her. Did you see who left me? A beat too long. No. Taryn muttered, That means maybe. Malin kept walking. It means I saw a hooded figure and a vehicle crest covered in mud. I reported the weather. I did not report the crest. Why? She stopped at the service stair door with her hand on the latch and did not turn around. Because I recognized the driver's gloves, upper-tier household livery, hand-stitched. I had a brother in debt labor by then. Helion funded the district clinic that kept him alive. I told myself if I wrote less, I was protecting him from a war between people richer than us. She faced me then, no softness left. He died 2 winters later anyway. No one spoke. Human messiness never gives you clean villains when it can give you compromised witnesses instead. The service stair opened into chaos. The public intake hall was full of residents, officials, and security in the middle of 3 different arguments. Relocation notices had turned into shouting when the outage interrupted the digital registry kiosks. Warrant officers pushed toward the sub-level stairs looking for me. 2 guild compliance auditors were loudly asserting jurisdiction over documents none of them had. The Helion observer stood near the front desk, speaking into a calm slate with the controlled posture of someone trying not to look alarmed. Above them all, the legacy intake display board hung dark and dust-coated on the far wall. Malin whispered, Board relay is behind the admissions counter. Taryn grinned, the dangerous one. Finally, a task. He peeled off left through the crowd before I could stop him, moving like a man born to survive by looking accidental. Malin went right toward the side aisle as if she still worked there and expected the hallway to make room. I kept my head down and followed the line of pillars toward the admissions counter. Coat closed over the packet and token. Every warrant officer in the hall suddenly too close. The Helian observer saw me first. Her eyes locked on mine across the room and her voice cut through the noise. Detain him. Everything sped up. A security officer reached for my coat. I twisted free and drove him into a kiosk. Residents screamed and surged backward. The dark intake board flickered once as Taryn dropped behind the admissions counter and ripped open the relay panel with his pry bar. 30 seconds, he yelled. A warrant officer drew a shock baton and came in low. I caught his wrist, took the hit along my forearm anyway, and felt my hand go numb to the elbow. Taryn, still crouched in the relay panel, yelled, "Ray, it's pulling more data." The board flickered again and dumped a second block of text, corrupted but readable enough. Observation flag, pulse binding, manifestation watch recovery. Priority if confirmed status update, pending. I felt the room look at me differently all at once. Not just abandoned child, not just auditor, asset. The Helian observer saw the same shift and changed tactics in real time. District security, she called sharply. The subject is classified under succession risk and hazardous anomaly designation. Contain the area. There it was. Strip the claim. Reframe the person as dangerous. Old move. A young security lieutenant near the pillar looked from her to the board to the warrant slate in his hand and did something I did not expect. He lowered the slate. "Oh, my authority covers public order," he said carefully. "Not contested succession seizure with exposed registry contradiction." The observer stared at him. For one brutal second, I thought the crest filing had removed too much to authenticate. Then the board above us hummed and lit. Not fully. Half the display remained dead. But the left side came alive in amber text, cycling archaic registry code across the public hall where everyone could see it. The noise in the room dropped by half on instinct. People may not understand old system language, but they recognize official truth when it powers on by itself. The board displayed, intake record query, token chain requested unclaimed minor/flood cycle entry name, status withheld evidence, token sunburst crest, altered, chain alert, correction override detected at the 8th source. The board paused. The hall held its breath. Then the next line burned onto the screen in larger text. Because old systems love clarity when new ones prefer ambiguity. A youth source Helian Domestic Trust/private request. The hall exploded. Residents shouted. Civic officials started talking over each other. One guild auditor actually said, "That cannot display in public mode," as if the machine might apologize. The warrant officers hesitated, and that hesitation was everything. I pulled the Helian directive from my coat and held it up. Predated detention order, suppression directive, intake correction tied to the same trust. You arrest me now. You do it in front of the record you tried to bury. The Helian observer stopped at the exit and turned back, expression finally stripped clean of neutrality. "That document is unauthenticated," Malin answered before I could. "Then contest it formally under oath and explain why your warrant was issued before the inspection began." Heads turned toward her. Several recognized her. More importantly, they recognized the chapel insignia she no longer wore. A quarter authority speaking against Helian in a public hall was not normal. In Sol Avern, abnormal truth travels faster than official statements. You are refusing a lawful order. "I am declining to pick the wrong law in a full hall," Taryn whispered, almost reverent. "I love him." The moment broke when one of the gray contractors from the Undercroft forced through the side doors with 2 more men and a retrieval case, clearly deciding subtlety had expired. He pointed straight at me and shouted, "Take the packet!" That made the lines visible for everyone. Helian legal, district warrants, civic security, private recovery crews, guild auditors. and a hall full of residents who now knew upper-tier hands had altered orphan intake records in their district. The first contractor reached me and swung a baton. I ducked, but my numb arm failed to block cleanly, and the strike clipped my shoulder hard enough to spin me into the admissions counter. Pain flashed white, as the intake packet slid across the wood. Taryn came out of the relay panel like he'd been fired from it, pry bar in both hands. He cracked the contractor across the ribs and yelled, "Nobody steals babies twice today!" It was not elegant, but it worked. Malin grabbed the packet, not to run with it, but to hold it high above the counter where 3 residents and both guild auditors could see the red archive thread and state seal. "Witness this!" she shouted, voice carrying over the hall in a way I remembered from fire drills. Original intake packet under state seal, hidden after private correction request. Witness the board. Witness the warrant time. You can mock public scenes all you want. They still matter when enough people are forced to see the same thing at once. The guild auditors moved then. Not for justice, for jurisdiction. Close enough. They stepped between the contractors and the counter, as shouting about evidence custody and unauthorized private extraction. Security officers moved to separate bodies, not seize me. Residents started filming on cheap slates. The Hellion observer realized the room was no longer a controlled environment and backed through the exit, already speaking into comms, already preparing the next version of the story. She caught my eye one last time before the doors closed behind her. No fear, no panic. Calculation. This was not over. It had barely started. By the time district medics arrived to treat the injured and upper-tier legal notices began pouring in, the contradiction had spread beyond the annex. Someone uploaded a clip of the legacy board to 3 market channels before security locked local comms. Someone else posted the warrant timestamp. The phrase, "unnamed heir," started circulating in lower-tier message threads within the hour. Half rumor, half accusation. I hated the wording, but I understood the velocity. I did not leave in handcuffs. I also did not leave free. The guild invoked temporary protective custody under internal audit privilege, which sounds dignified and feels like a locked room with better chairs. Taryn got detained for assault, interference, relay tampering, and unofficially, embarrassing 2 contractor teams and a Hellion observer before lunch. Malin gave a statement that implicated herself in archive concealment and then requested legal counsel from a district aid office she used to recommend to children she'd already failed. The young security lieutenant filed a neutral incident report, so narrow and precise, I silently thanked him for every line. That evening, in a guild-holding suite overlooking Tier 6 transit rails, I finally opened the intake packet. I expected revelation in a clean shape. Birth name, parent signatures, a dramatic answer. What I got was Sol Averne, state intake forms, flood cycle timestamp, foundling condition notes, evidence token intake, provisional health screening, and 1 attachment page inserted later under private authority and stamped partially over the original lines. The attachment confirmed financial reimbursement to the annex for administrative correction and continuity risk management. It referenced Hellion. It referenced my pulse binding only as a contingency marker to be monitored if manifested. And in the margin of the original intake sheet, in cramped ink almost missed under the flood stain, 1 handwritten note from the intake officer on duty before the corrections. Left wrapped in upper house linen. Infant had fever. Driver did not meet my eyes. No crest, no names, just that. I read the line until the ink blurred, not because it proved everything. Because it proved enough to hurt. Taryn got released after midnight on a bond I paid before the clerk finished pretending to object. He came into the suite limping, lips split, and grinning like a man who had stolen weather. "You should see the lower threads," he said, dropping into the chair opposite mine. Annex residents are furious. Half the city thinks you're a fraud. The other half thinks Hellion's been laundering bloodlines through state intakes for years. The smart half thinks both can be true and is waiting for the ledgers. I slid the intake packet toward him. He read the margin note, then looked up. His voice was quieter than usual. "You okay?" "No, good. You'd worry me if you were calm." I almost smiled. He leaned back, winced at his ribs, and pointed at the papers. "So what now, billionaire?" That word sounded ugly in that room, too simple for what money had and hadn't bought me. And I looked out the window at the transit rails cutting light through the dark tiers below. Trains still ran. Quotas still held. Families still got flagged for missing payments. My file was no longer buried, but the system that buried it remained intact and very much awake. Helion would litigate. The guild would bargain. Civic would stall. Private firms would shred records if allowed. I thought of the line in the suppression directive. Do not register him dead. Use later if needed. They had left me alive as a contingency asset, a reserve tool, a future line item. I set the directive beside the intake packet and the bronze token between us on the table, the filed-down sunburst catching the sweet lamp in 3 dull rays. Now, I said, we find out how many other people were corrected. Taryn stared at me for a second, then laughed despite the bruises, because of course that was the answer. Outside, the rails kept moving under purchased light. And somewhere in the city, my blood family was already preparing statements, denials, offers, and threats. In the glass, my reflection looked like a man with expensive clothes, a legal claim, and no clean inheritance left to want. The bronze token sat between my hand and the paperwork like a witness that had waited too long to be called. I did not pick it up again that night.